Chapter 1. The Lonely Birthday Song. Grace Leighton had always loved the smell of vanilla frosting. Every year on her birthday, she would wake up early, tiptoe to the kitchen, and pull out the baking mix her mother bought 2 weeks before. It wasn't that she loved baking, she didn't. What she loved was pretending. Pretending that this year, someone else would bake the cake. That the kitchen would already be filled with the scent of something warm, sweet, and made with love. That the living room would be strung with paper streamers and the sounds of cheerful claps. But the reality was always quieter. That morning, on her 7th birthday, Grace stood on a stool in their small Portland apartment, stirring a lumpy bowl of cake batter with too much oil and not enough eggs. Her oversized birthday girl t-shirt slid off one shoulder as she concentrated. The sun peeked through the window, lighting up the tiny specks of flour on the counter like glitter. Her plastic tiara, bought from the dollar store, sat slightly crooked on her head. Her mother had left early again. There was a note taped to the fridge as always. "Happy birthday, Gracie. Mama will try to be back before bedtime. There's pizza money in the drawer. Love you so much, Mom." Grace read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it into her shoebox of birthday notes under her bed. Her father, Robert, had called from the road the night before, saying he wouldn't make it. "Daddy's got a long haul to Nevada, sweet pea. I'll bring you a stuffed llama next time, promise." She was used to it. Grace wasn't one to cry. She had cried on her 5th birthday, waiting in the hallway with a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, birthday party starts here." But her mom never showed up until midnight. Since then, she decided it was better not to wait. She decorated her own cake with mismatched candy buttons and candles left from last year. She set the table with paper plates and poured soda into a tea set cup. Then she sat down alone and sang happy birthday to herself. Her voice was small but steady. "Happy birthday to me." She imagined guests clapping. A room full of kids from school, Amanda, Kai, maybe even Lucy, the girl with glitter pens. She imagined her mother appearing behind her with a cake, smiling proudly. But when she opened her eyes, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the faint humming of traffic outside. Later, she opened her gift, a new set of colored pencils her mom had left in a paper bag. The wrapping was missing, but Grace didn't mind. She took the pencils to her room and drew a picture of the cake she had imagined, 3 layers, pink roses, and sparkler candles. She wrote in tiny letters under it, "Someday." That night, when her mother tiptoed in face weary, hands red from washing dishes for 12 hours, Grace was already in bed, pretending to sleep. She didn't want to see the guilt in her mother's eyes again. She didn't want to say it's okay anymore when it wasn't. Linda stood there for a moment, watching her daughter's small figure under the blanket. She bent down, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby. I missed it again." She never saw Grace's eyes blink open. The years passed like faded photographs. Birthdays came and went. Grace developed a ritual: bake a cake, eat a slice, save the rest, and write about it in her journal. She became efficient, organized. She never forgot to buy candles, never needed help. It became less about celebration and more about control, her way of claiming something no one could take away. At school, Grace was known as the quiet art girl. She rarely invited anyone over. Not because she didn't want to, but because what would she show them? A living room with no decorations? A birthday with no parents? It was better this way, just her, the cake, and the silence. On her 10th birthday, the power went out. She lit candles around the cake and drew shadows on the walls. On her 12th, she burned the edges of the frosting trying to use a blowtorch she found in the garage. By 14, she no longer cared if the cake was perfect. No one ever asked her how she spent her birthdays. Not her teachers. Not the neighbors. Not even the church lady who sometimes brought cookies. Grace liked it that way. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted someone to show up. But no one did. At 17, Grace moved to Seattle for college. The first thing she did in her new apartment was hang a string of fairy lights and buy a box of birthday candles from the corner store. Eliot would meet her 3 years later in a coffee shop, where she was sketching a birthday cake on the back of a napkin, out of habit. But that story hadn't started yet. For now, Grace was still the girl who learned to celebrate herself, who wore her tiara every July 12th, even if it didn't match her clothes, who stopped expecting and started surviving. But deep inside, in the corners she never spoke of, she kept a quiet hope that someday someone would remember without being reminded. That someday she wouldn't have to light her own candles. That someday the love she had only imagined would become real. And perhaps even then, she didn't know just how much someone had remembered all along. Chapter 2. The Note on the Fridge. Grace was 12 when she stopped singing Happy Birthday out loud. It wasn't a conscious decision. Just something that faded, like a childhood tune you outgrow without realizing. That year, the ritual was the same. She made her own birthday cake, cut a single slice, and ate it in silence. But this time, she didn't bother lighting candles. The flicker of flame felt too much like pretending, too much like hoping. Instead, she sat on the floor of her bedroom with her sketch pad, drawing cakes she would never taste. 3 layers, blue icing, strawberries lining the edge, a delicate swirl of whipped cream on top. Beneath the cake, she scribbled, 12 today. Mom said she'd be home. She isn't. Again. The note on the fridge that morning had been longer than usual. Written in her mother's rushed cursive, it read, Gracie, I know this year matters more. I wanted to be home by 6, I really did. But Mrs. Chin called in sick and the kitchen's a mess. I promise I'll be back before you sleep. Save me a slice? Love, Mom. Grace had stared at that note for a full minute. Then she pulled it down and folded it 4 times into a perfect square. She added it to the box under her bed labeled Birthday Archive. At the very back of the box were notes from years past, all of them promising return, all of them ending in delay. She should have known better. At 8 p.m., the pizza guy knocked. He was new, college-aged, with acne and a sheepish grin. He handed her a large pepperoni pizza and added, Your mom said to tell you she's really sorry. She paid extra for extra cheese. Grace blinked, then nodded. She didn't eat the pizza right away. She left it on the table, untouched, like a centerpiece to an invisible gathering. Instead, she went out to the porch and sat there barefoot, knees pulled to her chest. The summer air was warm, but Grace felt the chill of being forgotten. The neighborhood kids were setting off firecrackers early for the upcoming 4th of July. The crackle of sparklers filled the sky with pops of color, bright, fleeting, loud. Grace stared at the stars instead. Her father hadn't called. Not this year. He used to, at least. There were years he'd send postcards from Utah or Colorado. Once, he even sent her a birthday card from a gas station in Idaho with a bear on the front that said, Hope your day is very special. That had been her 9th birthday. Now, he was just another name on a voicemail list. At 10:23 p.m., the front door creaked. Grace didn't turn her head. Linda's footsteps were soft, almost nervous. Her mom still wore her uniform, white button-up stained with grease, black slacks smudged with flour. Her hair was tied up messily, and her eyes looked heavier than usual. Gracie, she said, almost in a whisper. Are you still up? Grace shrugged. I'm sorry I missed it again, Linda continued. I tried. I really tried. I know, Grace said, voice flat. There's pizza. Linda stepped forward, unsure. Did you eat? Not hungry. A long silence passed between them. Then Linda sat down beside her, slow and tired. You know, I bought a cake. Grace turned her head. A real one. With your name on it, Linda added quickly. From Baxter's Bakery. Your favorite. Chocolate fudge with raspberry filling. Grace's throat tightened. Where is it? She asked quietly. Linda's eyes filled with apology. It's still in the break room fridge. I forgot it. I was rushing. I didn't want to be any later. Grace didn't reply. She looked down at her hands. One fingernail was chipped. Her palms had sugar stains from the cake she didn't decorate. Linda fumbled with something in her pocket and pulled out a small Polaroid. She handed it to Grace. The photo was of a chocolate cake. Written on it in frosting, Happy 12th, Gracie. Waitress Janie took it for me. Said I'd want proof, Linda murmured. I know it doesn't mean much. I just thought you should know I didn't forget. Grace stared at the picture. She wanted to feel something. Joy, anger, gratitude, but all she felt was tired. Still. She placed the photo carefully on her lap and whispered, "Thanks." Linda reached for her hand but didn't force it. Instead, she sat quietly next to her daughter. The silence between them no longer sharp but soft, like a pause between two verses of a forgotten song. That night, as Grace brushed her teeth, she taped the Polaroid to the inside of her closet door. She didn't know why. She just didn't want to lose it. And though she didn't tell her mom, she did eat a slice of pizza before bed. One slice. Extra cheese. Cold, but somehow warm. As she crawled under the covers, Grace looked at the blank ceiling and whispered to herself, not out of habit but out of longing. Happy birthday to me. Chapter 3. The Birthday Archive. Grace's shoebox was her secret vault. Hidden beneath an old pile of sweaters at the bottom of her closet, the cardboard box was labeled in neat handwriting. Birthday Archive. Do not open unless you're me. Inside were folded notes, faded receipts, and the occasional crumpled paper napkin with half-melted frosting smudges. Each item was a quiet witness to another year past, another celebration spent alone, another promise that someone had meant to keep. At 13. Grace added a new item to the box, a dried-out balloon from the dollar store with faint purple letters that once read, "You're special." She'd bought it for herself after school. No one at school had remembered her birthday that year. Not even Amanda, who used to be her best friend until 7th grade, turned them into strangers. When Grace got home that day, she heated leftover pasta, lit one candle, and sang the birthday song under her breath. Her voice cracked halfway through the second line. She hadn't expected it to hurt, but it did. Afterward, she tore a piece of notebook paper in half and wrote, "I know this sounds dramatic. I don't even like cake anymore. But today still mattered to me. I wish someone else thought it did, too." She folded it, kissed the paper like she'd seen in movies, and added it to the box. That was the first time she cried on her birthday since she was 5. The shoebox grew heavier with each passing year, not because of its contents, but because of what it symbolized. A quiet grief, a ritual of disappointment, and a longing Grace never admitted out loud. Her mother had no idea about the box. Neither did her father, whose rare phone calls were growing shorter and less personal. "Hey, kiddo." Still drawing those comics, he'd say, clearly parked somewhere between gas stations, his voice muffled by static. "I saw a cool mural on the side of a truck stop. Thought of you." She would smile politely, say thanks, Dad, and then wait for the inevitable, "I'll send something soon." But nothing ever came. By the time Grace turned 15, she had stopped making birthday cakes. She claimed it was because of her new gluten allergy. In truth, she just couldn't stand the smell anymore. It reminded her of waiting, of disappointment in buttercream form. Instead, she painted. Each year, she created a canvas, a dream version of the birthday she wished she'd had. At 15, a sunlit garden party, with fairy lights strung across the trees and her mother in a flowy pink dress, bringing out a strawberry cake. At 16, a movie night with popcorn and cozy blankets, her dad making jokes and her friends laughing beside her. At 17, a lakeside picnic, Eliot standing behind her with a sparkler and a smile. Even though she hadn't met Eliot yet, she'd imagined someone like him, someone who would remember, without her needing to remind. She never showed the paintings to anyone. They were for the box. Then came her 18th birthday. Legally an adult, emotionally exhausted, and finally free to leave. She packed her things, careful not to forget the shoebox, and moved to Seattle to attend art school. Her mother helped carry the suitcases, but didn't say much during the drive. At the curb, Linda gave her a check for $200 and said, "Spend it on whatever makes you happy." Grace nodded. They hugged. It was awkward. Not cold, but not warm either. Like a long-distance friendship that neither knew how to repair. As her mother drove away, Grace looked down at the check and muttered to herself, "What makes me happy?" Remembering. That night, she ordered takeout, hung fairy lights around her dorm, and painted one more canvas, this time with just a table, a candle, and an empty chair facing her. She labeled it, "Grace's 18th, still here." Then she folded the receipt from the takeout container and slid it into the archive box. It wasn't until she met Eliot that the box began to change. He was the first person to ask what her favorite birthday had been. Grace had blinked. None of them, she answered without thinking. Eliot didn't respond with sympathy. He just said, "Want to try making a new favorite? We can start this year." She wanted to say yes. Wanted to believe in the possibility. But the shoebox was like a shadow, it followed her even into the brightest moments. Still, something in Eliot's tone felt different. He didn't offer to fix her. He just offered to stand beside her. And maybe, Grace thought, that was enough. One rainy afternoon, shortly before her 23rd birthday, Eliot stumbled upon the shoebox. She had left it open while sorting through old art supplies. And when he peeked in, he found the Polaroid from her 12th birthday, the cake her mother had never brought home. "Can I ask about this?" Eliot said gently. Grace hesitated, then nodded. She told him everything, not in one breath, but slowly, through pauses and half-laugh stories, through the sharp memories and the soft ones. She showed him the notes, the drawings, even the dried balloon. Eliot didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just sat beside her, held her hand, and after a long silence said, "That box holds a lot of pain. But also a lot of proof that you kept going." Grace smiled. It was the first time she'd looked at the box and felt anything close to pride. That year, on her birthday, Eliot brought her a real cake. 3 layers. Blue icing. Strawberries on top. No sparkler candles. Just a note that said, "I know I can't rewrite the past, but I'll be here every year from now on." Cake and all. Grace didn't cry. Not right away. She just added the note to the shoebox. Carefully. Reverently. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone when she did. Chapter 4. The invitation she almost didn't send. Grace stared at the wedding invitation for the 3rd time that week. It sat on her desk like a question she didn't want to answer. Elegant script printed on thick ivory paper read, "You are warmly invited to the wedding of Grace Leighton and Eliot Ramirez. September 10th, 4 p.m. Blue Ridge Gardens, Seattle." The envelope to her mother was still unsealed. She had written Linda's name on the front twice already, once in pen, once in pencil, both times discarding it. Now, a fresh envelope sat in front of her, taunting her with silence. Not because Grace didn't want her mother there, but because she wasn't sure what she expected anymore. It wasn't anger. Not really. She wasn't that little girl crying beside a cake anymore. But it also wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was something in between. A wound she'd carried so long it had become part of her shape. Eliot came in with 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to Grace and kissed the top of her head. "Still thinking about whether to send it?" he asked. She nodded. "It feels weird. Like inviting someone I don't really know." Eliot sat down beside her. "Maybe that's exactly why you should send it." Grace looked down. "Do you think she even wants to come?" "I think she does," he said gently. "I think she doesn't know if you want her there." She bit her lip. That sounded true. "Remember what you told me about your 12th birthday?" Eliot continued. "The cake photo. The Polaroid. What kind of person remembers the cake every year and still shows up late?" Grace sighed. "The kind who feels guilty but doesn't know how to fix it." "Or maybe," Eliot said, "the kind who never stopped trying but thought she had already failed." That night, Grace finally sealed the envelope. She mailed it the next morning. Weeks passed. The wedding date drew closer. Eliot's mother was ecstatic. His 2 younger sisters were flying in from California and texting Grace nonstop about hairstyles and flower crowns. But from Linda, there was no reply. No RSVP. No call. No text. Grace told herself she didn't care. She focused on menus, on seating charts, on finding the right earrings. She told herself Eliot was enough, and he was. More than enough. Still, when she checked the mailbox each day, a tiny part of her hoped. Then, 2 days before the wedding, the doorbell rang. Grace opened the door to find a courier holding a brown package. Medium-sized. No return address. She signed for it, confused, and took it inside. On top was a note in handwriting she hadn't seen in years. I don't know if I have the right to be there, but I wanted you to have this first. Love, Mom. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the package. Inside was a worn leather-bound notebook tied with faded pink ribbon. Grace sat down slowly, placed the book in her lap, and untied the ribbon. The first page was labeled, "Birthday Cakes for Gracie." She flipped it open and stopped breathing. Every page held a photograph of a birthday cake. Some from Baxter's Bakery, others clearly homemade. Each picture had a date and her age. Happy 8th, Gracie, vanilla bean with lemon filling. Gracie's 10th, marble cake with sprinkles too. 14 p.m. order placed. 13 today. Chocolate fudge with raspberry, left in break room again. I'm sorry. Page after page, year after year, the cakes were there. Not just the cakes, but notes scribbled in the margins. Didn't make it home again. Gracie said she was fine, but her eyes looked empty. Tried calling Robert to remind him. No answer. She deserves more. Paid extra for her favorite one. Hope she didn't throw it out this time. Watched her from the doorway. She looked so much like me when I was 12. God, I miss her. Grace's eyes filled with tears. The book blurred in front of her. These weren't just orders. They were her mother's memories. Regrets. Hopes. Confessions no one had ever read. Each photo, each scrawled sentence was proof. Linda had never forgotten. She just hadn't known how to show up the right way. Grace held the book against her chest. Then she cried, not with the bitterness of a child, but with the ache of a woman finally understanding. 2 days later, as soft string music floated through the garden air and guests began to settle into their chairs, Grace stood in her white gown, hands clasped with Eliot's. She scanned the crowd, and her breath caught. In the very back row, quietly, humbly, sat Linda Leighton, wearing her best navy blue dress, holding a tiny bouquet, face shining with tears. And in her lap, tucked carefully inside her purse, was the leather-bound book. Grace didn't wave. She didn't need to. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, 100 unsaid birthdays passed between them. Forgiveness didn't need a speech. Love, sometimes, didn't need to be loud. Chapter 5. The Girl Who Stopped Waiting. Grace moved to Seattle the week after she turned 18. She didn't cry when the train pulled away from Portland. She didn't wave at her mother through the window. She didn't even look back. She had learned long ago that expecting people to stay, especially family, was the quickest way to be disappointed. Her mother had helped her carry the bags to the platform. The goodbye was brief. Call when you get there, Linda had said. I will, Grace replied, but she didn't. Not because she wanted to hurt her mother, but because she didn't know how to explain the heaviness inside her chest. Leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt like fleeing a house that always smelled like flour and absence. She told herself she needed distance to breathe. And for the first time in her life, she had a room that was truly hers. Her dorm was nothing special: cream walls, squeaky floorboards, a twin mattress that sagged in the middle, but Grace stood in the middle of it like she had just unlocked a new dimension. The first thing she unpacked was her fairy lights. The second was her shoebox. She placed it in the top shelf of the closet this time, not the bottom. She was no longer hiding it. But she also didn't tell her roommate, Mallory, what was inside. Mallory was loud and spontaneous. She had a contagious laugh and wore mismatched socks on purpose. Within a week, she dragged Grace to 2 open mic nights, 3 gallery shows, and 1 improv comedy show that made Grace's face hurt from laughing. But when Grace's 19th birthday came around, she didn't tell anyone. She skipped class that day, ordered a small cake online, and told the delivery guy to leave it at the front desk. No candles. No decorations. No notes. She sat on the edge of her bed, took a photo of the cake for the archive, and cut a single slice. It was good. Moist, sweet. But it didn't taste like celebration. Later that evening, Mallory came home humming. She paused when she saw the cake box on the desk. "Whose birthday?" she asked. Teasing. "Don't tell me I missed free cake." Grace looked up. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she smiled faintly. "Mine." Mallory's eyes widened. "Today? Are you serious?" "Grace, why didn't you say anything?" Grace shrugged. "It's just a day." Mallory stared at her, then slowly walked over and plopped down beside her on the bed. "You're weird," she said. "But I like you. And weird girls don't get to eat birthday cake alone on my watch." She grabbed 2 forks from the kitchen drawer and lit a scented candle from her desk, sticking it in the half-eaten cake like a beacon of improvised festivity. And then, without asking for permission, Mallory sang. Loud. Off-key. With too many flourishes. Grace couldn't help it, she laughed. It wasn't the laugh of someone being polite. It was the kind that came from somewhere deeper. The kind she didn't know was still there. Later that night, Grace added the candle to the archive box. She labeled it 19, the first time someone sang for me. College gave Grace a new sense of self. She studied visual design and took an unexpected interest in typography. She joined the campus art club, then dropped it after realizing she hated meetings. She started a freelance side hustle making logos for small businesses and never told anyone that her favorite part was choosing the color palettes. For the first time, she was creating not just art, but a life. A life she designed piece by piece, color by color. And yet, the quiet always followed her around birthdays. On her 21st, she booked a solo trip to the coast. No cake. No calls. Just the ocean and a rented cabin with a fireplace that never worked. She walked along the shoreline with bare feet and wind in her hair and told herself this was how freedom looked. No expectations, no disappointments. But that night, curled in a too-soft armchair, she stared at her phone. No text from her mother. Not even a generic happy birthday message. She didn't cry. But she did scroll through old photos, grainy snapshots of birthday cakes. Notes on napkins, the Polaroid of the cake from Baxter's Bakery at 12, and she felt the weight of it. All the remembering. All the pretending not to care. She opened her journal and wrote, "I think I still want someone to care, even if I've trained myself not to need it." She folded the page and placed it in the shoebox. Then, with no candles, no music, and no one watching, she whispered into the silence. Happy birthday, Grace. It would be 2 more years before Eliot entered her life. But by then, she had already learned the quiet rituals of survival. What she hadn't yet learned, what she was still unprepared for, was what it felt like when someone loved her loudly. And never forgot. Chapter 6. The Stranger Who Noticed. Grace met Eliot on an afternoon that wasn't supposed to be special. She had walked into the cafe near campus with her sketchpad under one arm and a familiar heaviness in her chest. Her 23rd birthday was just a week away, and she had already picked out the cake she would order herself, chocolate almond with salted caramel drizzle. It sounded indulgent enough to make the day feel tolerable, if not celebratory. The cafe was quiet, except for the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the faint hum of indie music playing overhead. She slid into her usual booth in the back corner and ordered a matcha latte. Then, as she often did, she opened her sketchbook and began drawing cakes. Not literal cakes, imagined ones. Tiered, towering, whimsical. Some shaped like lanterns. Some floating on clouds. Some with tiny paper birds perched on each layer. She added ribbons, candles, invisible hands delivering them to invisible children. It was her way of rewriting her memories. Of designing a better birthday for a girl who had never really had one. She didn't notice the man at the next table until he spoke. That one's too pretty to eat. She looked up, startled. A tall man in a navy jacket, soft curls tucked behind his ears, smiled gently at her sketchpad. I'm sorry, he added quickly, holding up his hands. Didn't mean to interrupt. Those are amazing. Are you an illustrator? Grace hesitated. She wasn't used to strangers commenting on her art. She closed her sketchbook halfway, uncertain. Kind of. I do freelance design work. Mostly logos. This is just for me. The man nodded. Well, you have an eye for whimsy. I'm Eliot, by the way. There was a pause. A chance to brush him off. But something in his voice, low, kind, unassuming, disarmed her. I'm Grace, she said, and offered a small smile. They didn't talk for long. Just a few minutes. He asked what she liked about design. She asked what he did. He was a software engineer, freelance like her. Before leaving, he scribbled his number on a napkin and said, in case you ever want to talk about cakes. Or design. Or anything. She pocketed the napkin. She didn't know then that she would call him 3 days later. Or that their first real conversation would last 3 hours. Or that he would become the first person in her life to remember her birthday without being told. Their friendship began slowly. Eliot never pushed. He asked questions like he genuinely wanted to know the answers. He listened without interrupting. And most importantly, he noticed things. He noticed how she only wore her hair down on cloudy days. He noticed the way she turned her coffee mug 3 times before taking a sip. And he noticed, months later, as her birthday approached, that she grew quieter and more distracted. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, sharing a bowl of oversalted popcorn, he asked gently, "Do you have plans next week?" Grace shrugged. "Just work." "Nothing else?" She looked at him. He didn't press. But there was a knowing softness in his gaze. She hesitated. "It's my birthday," she said, almost like a confession. "But I don't really do anything for it." Eliot tilted his head. "Not even dinner?" "I usually just get cake," she said. "By myself." He didn't speak right away. Then he nodded and said, "Well, if you're okay with not being by yourself this year, I'd like to make you dinner." She wanted to say no. She had spent years learning how not to hope. But the way he asked, without pressure, without pity, made her pause. "Okay," she said. "But no singing." "Deal." Eliot smiled. On the evening of her birthday, she arrived at his apartment and was greeted not by balloons or banners, but by soft music, the smell of garlic and lemon, and a neatly set table for 2. He had made her favorite, pasta with roasted vegetables and lemon cream sauce. "Dessert's not fancy," he said, pulling a small cake box from the fridge. "But I did ask the bakery to add something." He opened the box. It was a simple vanilla cake with buttercream frosting. On top, written in soft, slanted script, "You are not forgotten." Grace blinked hard. No one had ever written that to her before. No one had ever said it either. She didn't cry. Not fully. But something in her cracked open. And she let Eliot pull her into a quiet, long hug. No words. Just warmth. After dinner, they watched a movie neither of them paid attention to. And that night, Grace slipped the cake box note into her archive, now a small wooden chest she kept on a shelf in her bedroom. She added a new label. 23, the year someone noticed before I had to ask. Chapter 7. The quiet between them. After that birthday, something shifted between Grace and Eliot. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden kiss in the rain or grand confession under the stars. Instead, there was consistency. Eliot kept showing up, not with bouquets or declarations, but with steady warmth, sending her funny memes during deadlines, texting her to eat when she skipped meals, and always, always remembering the little things. Grace didn't know what to do with that kind of attention. She was used to people forgetting, to being the afterthought. She didn't trust easily, not because she didn't want to, but because trusting felt like setting herself up for another invisible birthday cake. So, she waited for him to slip. She waited for the day he would cancel plans with a last-minute excuse. For the moment his attention would fade. For the eventual distance people always built between themselves and her. But it didn't happen. Eliot was not perfect. He was forgetful with groceries, clumsy with coffee cups, and sometimes got so wrapped up in code he missed entire conversations. But he never made her feel small. Never made her feel like she was asking for too much by simply existing. It scared her. Because part of her had already built a life around being unnoticed. And now here was someone who noticed everything. One afternoon, they sat on the floor of Eliot's apartment, sorting through old photos for a digital project. Grace had brought her sketchbook to scan some designs, and while flipping through the pages, Eliot paused. He stopped at one of the birthday cake drawings she had made years ago. It wasn't colorful, just pencil on paper, but intricate and emotional. A tall, four-tiered cake with miniature figures gathered around it. At the very top was a small girl with a paper crown, sitting alone. He looked up at her. "This one's heavy." Grace shrugged. "I drew it when I was 16. I imagined what it might look like if someone had thrown me a real party. With people." Eliot didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked quietly, "Did it hurt to draw?" She nodded. "A little. But it helped more than it hurt. Drawing was how I held on to things I never had." He studied the sketch again, then closed the book carefully. "Grace," he said softly, "you don't have to keep holding the whole weight of those birthdays by yourself." She looked at him. "I've done it for so long, I don't know what it feels like not to." He reached for her hand. "I'm not trying to fix anything," he said. "I just want you to know that when you're ready. You don't have to celebrate alone anymore." Her fingers tightened around his without thinking. And for the first time, Grace felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of safety. That evening, back in her apartment, Grace opened her archive box again. She had added Eliot's note from her 23rd birthday. But now she held something new, the scanned copy of the cake sketch he'd paused at. She clipped it to the inside lid of the box and wrote beneath it. Someone finally saw the girl at the top. Then she sat in the stillness, letting the thought settle. Not all healing came as a wave. Sometimes it came like this, quiet, cautious, and one page at a time. Weeks passed. And the seasons changed. They started spending more weekends together. Eliot introduced her to his older sister, who liked Grace instantly and sent her texts like, "I'm glad he found someone with actual taste." Grace didn't correct the assumption that they were already together. But they weren't. Not officially. One night, as they walked through the late winter chill of Capitol Hill, Eliot stopped beneath a street lamp, looked at her and said, "Is it okay if I ask you something?" Grace tilted her head. "Depends what it is." He smiled, nervous this time. "Would it be weird if I said I wanted to call you my girlfriend?" Grace blinked. Not because she was surprised, but because her first instinct, strangely, was fear. Not fear of Eliot, but fear of what being loved might cost her. She wanted to say yes. Every part of her wanted to say yes. But old voices stirred. What if it ends? What if he forgets, too? What if you give everything and it's still not enough? She looked down. I don't know, she admitted. I think I need more time. Eliot nodded immediately. That's okay. I just thought I should ask. And he didn't push. They kept walking. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, it was gentle. Like space being made for something not yet ready to bloom. Grace smiled to herself in the dark. Maybe love didn't have to rush. Maybe, this time, it could arrive like spring, soft, slow, and certain. Chapter 8. The birthday she almost forgot. Grace didn't notice the date until it was already here. She had been so caught up in back-to-back client work, new commissions, and Eliot's sister visiting from California that the number July 12th didn't ring any alarms until she opened her phone that morning and saw the calendar notification blinking. Birthday cake, Grace's birthday, all day. For a split second, her chest tightened. Not because she was sad, but because she hadn't remembered first. For over a decade, her birthday had lived in her bones like a warning bell. A subtle shift in the air. A tension in her shoulders. Even when she pretended not to care, the date had always arrived with weight. But now, here it was slipping past her without grief, without preparation. She blinked, sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to process the unfamiliar emptiness. Did this mean she was finally healed? Or had she simply stopped expecting it to matter? Just then, Eliot walked in with a tray. "Morning, birthday girl," he said casually, setting it down. Scrambled eggs, toast, her favorite berry yogurt, and a tiny cupcake, frosted blue, with a single gold candle standing upright. Grace stared. "You remembered." Eliot laughed. Of course I did. You didn't? She shook her head slowly. Not until just now. Well, that's a good sign, he said, sitting beside her. It means this year is already better than the last. She looked at the cupcake. The candle was still unlit. I don't have anything planned, she murmured. Didn't order a cake. Didn't buy a balloon. I forgot my own tradition. Maybe that tradition isn't needed anymore. He said gently. Maybe you don't have to prove anything to yourself now. She exhaled. It felt strange. Freeing, but strange. He handed her a lighter. Want to do the honors? She hesitated. Then lit the candle. The flame danced quietly between them. Eliot started to sing. Happy birthday to you. Grace shook her head with a laugh. You promised no singing. But I didn't promise I'd be good at it, he grinned. She rolled her eyes and let him finish the song. For once, she didn't mind the spotlight. When he reached the final line, Happy birthday, dear Grace, her eyes welled with tears. She hadn't cried on her birthday in years. But this time, the tears weren't about being forgotten. They were about being remembered, and not needing to remember alone. Later that day, they went out for lunch at a quiet cafe by the lake. No streamers, no surprise party. Just sandwiches, soft laughter, and the smell of warm pine from the trees around them. As they ate, Eliot reached into his bag and pulled out a small, rectangular box. No pressure, he said, handing it to her. Just something I found last month and thought of you. Grace opened the lid. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook. The kind she loved but rarely splurged on. Tucked into the front flap was a folded note. She unfolded it slowly. For every cake you imagined. For every year you made it through. I can't change the past. But I hope to be part of every birthday from here on. Love, E. She held the note against her chest, too overwhelmed to speak. I didn't know what to get someone who always draws her own joy. Eliot said, quietly. So I figured, maybe now you could draw what's real. Grace smiled through the tears. This is real, she whispered. You're real. That night, she pulled out her archive box. She hadn't opened it in months. The wooden lid creaked slightly as she lifted it, the familiar scent of paper and ink greeting her like an old friend. She added Eliot's note to the very top. Then, for the first time ever, she took out one of her oldest entries, the drawing of the imagined party from her 15th birthday. The one with the long table, the friends who never came. The empty chair at the head. She stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, she took a pencil and added one more figure, this one seated in the empty chair. It looked like Eliot. Then she shaded in a few more guests. Mallory, his sisters. The cafe barista who once gave her free coffee and said, "You look like someone who deserves more than drip." And finally, she added herself, smiling. Not the silent girl in a paper crown, but the woman she was now. She labeled it 24, the year I didn't have to imagine anymore. Chapter 9. The letter with no stamp. 3 months after Grace's birthday, a small, cream-colored envelope arrived in her mailbox. There was no return address, no stamp. And her name was written in careful cursive that was hauntingly familiar. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a letter. Handwritten. 6 pages folded in half. The first line read, "I'm sorry it took me this long to say these things out loud." It was from her mother. Linda had dropped it off in person. Grace realized that later. She must have driven all the way from Portland and placed it in the mailbox herself, maybe too afraid to knock on the door. Grace sat down on the couch, heart pounding, and began to read. Gracie. Asterisk, you probably don't want to hear from me right now. I've written and rewritten this letter a dozen times in my head, but this is the first time I've actually put it on paper. I know I missed a lot. I know birthdays are supposed to be about presents, not presents. And I wasn't present, not the way you needed me to be. I thought I was doing what I had to do to keep our family afloat. The bills didn't stop, and your dad was gone more than he was home, and I kept telling myself that if I worked harder, I could make up for it later. Asterisk. Grace paused, the words pressing into her like soft thorns. Asterisk, but there was no later, was there? Every year I'd imagine walking through the door with your cake. I imagined your face lighting up. I imagined singing to you while we cut slices, and you told me about school and drawings and everything I missed. But every year I arrived to a dark apartment, a piece of uneaten cake, and a daughter who stopped looking up when I walked through the door. Asterisk. Grace covered her mouth. She had never imagined her mother saw those moments so clearly. Asterisk. I never stopped caring, Grace. I just didn't know how to show it. I thought working late, paying for your art classes, saving for college, that was love. I see now that I should have said it more. I should have made less money and more memories. I thought if I could just make your life easier, it would be enough. Asterisk. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She thought about the cakes in the notebook. All the times her mother had remembered, but from too far away. Asterisk. I found the photo of your 6th birthday the other day. You were wearing a red paper crown. You made it at school. You told me that morning, I'm going to wear this all day so nobody forgets. I wish I'd listened better. Asterisk. Grace pressed her hand to her chest. She remembered that crown. It had torn by lunchtime. Asterisk. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I just want you to know that I see you now. And I kept that notebook not because I was proud, but because I didn't want to forget what I failed to give you. You are the strongest, most beautiful person I know. I hope someday you'll let me know you're okay. I hope I haven't lost you completely. Asterisk. The letter ended simply. Love. Mom. Grace folded the letter carefully, hands trembling. She didn't cry the way she used to, curled up and silent. She cried upright, breathing deeply, letting it wash through her. Because this pain was different now. Not fresh. Not sharp. It was the ache of a door being unlocked after so many years. Eliot came home an hour later and found her sitting on the floor with the letter in her lap. She looked up. It was from her. He didn't need to ask who. He sat beside her. Waited. Grace passed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, then placed it gently on the coffee table. He didn't say, "That's good." He didn't say, "Now everything's better." He said, "How do you feel?" And she answered honestly, like someone finally turned on the porch light. That night, she didn't add the letter to the archive box. She kept it on her bedside table, right beside the lamp, where she could reach it any time. For once, the past didn't feel like something to store away. It felt like something that could be rewritten. Chapter 10. The phone call that didn't wait. It took Grace 3 days to pick up the phone. She had read her mother's letter at least a dozen times by then, memorizing the parts that stung. And the parts that softened. The line that echoed in her head the most was, "I hope I haven't lost you completely." And the truth was, her mother hadn't. Not completely. There was still a thread. Faint but unbroken, tying them together through every missed cake and unsaid word. But reaching across that distance now, it felt like walking a tightrope without knowing where it would land. Eliot didn't push. He simply asked each night, "Still thinking about it?" And Grace would nod. Until the 3rd night, when she finally said, "I'm ready." She sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, staring at her mother's contact name, Mom, Portland. It hadn't been updated since she was 16. Her finger hovered over the call button. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know what she wanted to hear. Maybe just anything. Maybe just the sound of someone who had carried her heart quietly for 23 years and was finally brave enough to speak. She pressed call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, Grace. Her mother's voice was cautious, breathless, a little older than she remembered it sounding. Grace blinked back the lump in her throat. "Hi, Mom." A pause. Then her mother exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath for years. "Oh, baby," she whispered. "You called." Grace nodded, even though no one could see it. "I got your letter. I didn't know if I should send it." "I'm glad you did." There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Her mother's voice softened. How are you?" Grace took a deep breath. "I'm good. Working. Still drawing. Eliot and I are," she stopped herself. "You'd like him." "I know I would," her mother said. "He sounds like someone who sees you." That line settled in her chest. They talked for 15 minutes. About nothing and everything. The weather. Work. A memory from kindergarten neither of them had mentioned in years. Linda mentioned she still worked part-time at the restaurant, but had been taking baking classes on weekends. I made a lemon tart last week, she said. It was too sour, but I thought of you. Grace smiled. Lemon was always your favorite, her mom added, almost shyly. I remembered. I know. Grace whispered. You remembered every year, didn't you? Another long silence. Then Linda said, very quietly, I remembered everything, Grace. I just didn't know how to be what you needed. Grace stared at the carpet. But you tried, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. And for the first time, it felt like enough. After the call, Grace sat on the balcony with Eliot, watching the city lights blink like slow, steady heartbeats. She told him everything. The quietness in her mother's voice. The way it trembled, but didn't crack. The way the word baby had landed differently this time, not as guilt, not as habit, but as love finally spoken. So what now? Eliot asked gently. Grace leaned against his shoulder. I don't know, she said honestly. I think we keep going. Carefully. He nodded. That's how all healing happens, he said. Step by step. Voice by voice. Before bed, Grace went to the archive box. She didn't open it. She just touched the lid. Not as someone burdened by it, but as someone who had learned from it. Who had found beauty in the ache. Who had drawn strength from the silence. She walked away without adding anything new that night. Because for once, there was nothing she needed to store away. Chapter 11. A table set for 3. It had been 8 months since Grace made the phone call. Since then, she and her mother had fallen into a rhythm, not quite close, not quite distant. They spoke once a week. Usually on Sunday evenings. It began with safe things, what Grace was working on, whether Linda's latest lemon tart had finally balanced the sour. Gradually, the calls deepened, slowly touching the past, then retreating again like waves approaching the shore. But it was progress. And one afternoon in late spring, Linda asked something Grace didn't expect. Would you and Eliot want to come for dinner? Grace blinked at the message. She reread it 3 times. Her mother didn't say come home or visit the house. She said dinner. Like a simple offering, no pressure. No expectations. Grace didn't respond right away. But Eliot, who had glanced over her shoulder and read the message, just smiled and said, I'd love to meet the woman who made 20 birthday cakes no one ever ate. They drove down to Portland the next Saturday. The city looked smaller than Grace remembered. Or maybe she had just outgrown the shadow it used to cast. The apartment complex where she grew up still stood, though the paint was more faded and the playground had been replaced with a parking lot. Her mother didn't live there anymore. Linda had moved into a small rented house on the east edge of town, quiet, clean, filled with light from wide windows. As they pulled into the driveway, Grace's heart began to race. What if the silence came back? What if it was awkward? What if this was all pretend? But Eliot took her hand as she unbuckled her seatbelt and said simply, We go one room at a time. The front door opened before they even knocked. Linda stood there, apron on, cheeks slightly flushed from the oven heat. Her eyes welled immediately, but she didn't cry. She just smiled and opened her arms. Grace stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, and hugged her. It wasn't a long hug, but it was whole. When they pulled apart, Linda looked at Eliot. You must be the one who brought the blue cupcake. He laughed. Guilty. You're already my favorite, she said, then glanced at Grace with a smirk. Don't worry, it's a short list. It was the kind of joke they hadn't known how to make a year ago. Grace felt something settle inside her, like a chair finally pushed into place at the dinner table. The meal was simple. Roast chicken, garlic potatoes, and the lemon tart that had caused so much drama in Linda's baking class. Grace helped slice vegetables while Linda basted. Eliot set the table and snuck bites of tart when no one was looking. It wasn't perfection, it was a little clumsy, a little loud, but it felt like something better. It felt like a family trying. As they ate, stories began to fill the gaps. Linda told Eliot about Grace's obsession with drawing cats on every piece of homework in 2nd grade. Grace told him how her mother once stayed up all night fixing a school project with only tape and glitter. Eliot told them about his sister's disastrous attempts at making holiday cookies and the oven fire that followed. Laughter spilled between bites. Not forced. Not fragile. Just real. After dinner, Linda disappeared into the kitchen for a moment and returned holding a small, worn binder. "I found this after you called," she said, placing it in front of Grace. "It's not the cake journal. You already have that one. This is the recipes." Grace blinked. Handwritten cards, some stained with vanilla and thyme, peeked from plastic sleeves. "Every year I tried a new flavor," Linda said. Voice soft. "Some were disasters. Some were okay. I never thought you'd want these, but now I think maybe you should have them." Grace touched the cover. It felt like holding history. "No one ever made cakes like this for me growing up," her mother added. "I didn't know how to do birthdays right. I just thought baking them was better than not trying at all." Grace looked at her. "Mom," she said, "you did try. I know that now." Linda reached across the table, eyes wet. "I wish I'd known how to show it sooner." Grace took her hand. "You're showing it now." As they left that night, Linda hugged her tighter. "Next time," she said softly, "maybe you can bring one of your sketches. I'd like to frame one." Grace smiled. "I'll bring you one of the cakes I used to imagine," she said. "Maybe we can bake it for real this time." Linda nodded, eyes glistening. "Maybe we can." That night, back in Seattle, Grace added a new label to her archive box. Dinner, 3 seats filled. One oven warm. One recipe passed down. And for the first time in her life, her birthday didn't feel like a story that ended in silence. It felt like a recipe still being written. Chapter 12. Baking from Memory. 2 weeks after the visit, Grace stood in her kitchen, apron tied and flour in her hair, holding a wooden spoon with the seriousness of someone diffusing a bomb. "Why does it say, 'fold gently' if everything's still lumpy?" she muttered. Eliot, reading from the recipe binder her mom had given her, looked up from the counter. "Because apparently, batter has feelings." Grace shot him a playful glare. They were attempting to bake one of Linda's original birthday cakes, strawberry almond with whipped cream frosting, Grace's imagined cake from age 15. And also the one Linda had noted as Gracie's favorite sketch, recreated from crumbs of memory. The plan wasn't just to bake it. The plan was to finally share it. Next weekend, Linda would visit Seattle for the first time in over a decade. It would be her first time seeing Grace's home. Her first time being invited into her daughter's space. And Grace wanted it to mean something. They had cleared their Saturday schedules just to prepare. By noon, the apartment smelled like warm sugar and chaos. Grace had never baked a full cake in her adult life. She usually settled for single slices from overpriced bakeries, but there was something grounding about this process. Measuring, mixing, pouring. It reminded her of her mother's letter, of the way her hands had always been full, with dough, with dishes, with duty, and yet somehow, she'd still managed to remember the recipe for love. Even if it came out late, even if it came without candles. The frosting, unfortunately, came out with lumps. Eliot tried to smooth it with a spatula while Grace circled him like a disappointed chef. "You didn't whip the cream long enough," she said. "You told me to stop before peaks formed." "I meant soft peaks." "Grace," he said, laughing, "we are in a committed relationship. But no part of me knows what soft peaks are." She rolled her eyes and reached for the whisk. Eventually, with a little improvisation and a lot of laughing, the frosting came together, soft, sweet. Messy perfection. They assembled the cake with care. 3 layers. Thin sliced strawberries between each. Cream swirled along the edges in haphazard spirals. Grace stepped back and looked at it like a finished painting. "It's not perfect," she said. Eliot wiped a smear of frosting from her cheek. "It's ours," he replied. That evening, they sat down with 2 forks and no plates. They didn't wait for her mom's visit to try it. They couldn't. The first bite surprised her. Not because of the taste, it was delicious, but because of what it brought with it. A rush of warmth. A sudden memory. She was 6 years old again. sitting on the floor with a plastic tiara and drawing a picture of a cake she wished someone had made for her. She had imagined the sweetness, the texture, the feeling of being known. Now, here it was. Real. Messy. Shared. Grace didn't speak for a while. Then, quietly, she said, "This is what it always should have felt like." Eliot nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "Let's make it a tradition. No more lonely birthdays. No more perfect ones either. Just real ones." She smiled. "And extra frosting. Obviously." Later that night, Grace took a photo of the cake, the real one, and slid it into the back of the archive box. She didn't label it like she used to. Instead, she placed it behind the imagined version of the same cake she'd drawn years ago. One dream. One reality. Two versions of the same longing, finally reconciled. When Sunday came, Grace stood in her apartment, waiting by the window. At exactly 3:07 p.m., a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Linda stepped out in a pale blue blouse, holding a small potted plant and a nervous smile. Grace opened the door before her mother had a chance to knock. "You're early," she teased. Linda shrugged. "I didn't want to be late." "Not this time." Grace reached for the plant and stepped aside. "Come in." And as her mother walked into the space Grace had made for herself, the walls lined with artwork, the scent of lemon lingering in the air, the cake already sliced on the counter, something quiet and profound passed between them. Not apology. Not guilt. Just presence. And this time, it was right on time. Chapter 13. The photo wall. Linda had never seen her daughter's home before. Not a dorm, not a short-term apartment, but home. The one Grace and Eliot had picked together, where the curtains were soft linen, and the mugs didn't match, and the fridge held more almond milk than actual food. For a moment, Linda just stood inside the doorway, taking it all in. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Grace gave a small smile. "It's small. It's you," Linda replied, her eyes trailing over the hand-drawn sketches taped beside the kitchen. Warm. Bright. A little messy in the corners. Eliot grinned. "That's my fault." Linda laughed, and the tension began to melt. They sat at the table, drinking tea and nibbling leftover cake. Linda complimented the frosting. Grace didn't tell her they'd nearly ruined it. Eliot winked at her from across the table and mouthed soft peaks, and Grace nearly choked on her tea. For once, they were all comfortable in the same space. There was no balancing act. No unspoken hurt pressing between them. Just warmth. After tea, Grace led her mother down the hallway. "There's something I want to show you," she said, her voice quiet. They stopped in front of a wall between the two bedrooms. It had been bare for months. Grace never liked hanging art unless she was sure. But now it was filled from corner to corner with photos. Not just photos. Moments. One showed the imagined birthday cake she'd drawn when she was 15, now framed beside the real one they had just baked. Another displayed her sketch of Eliot and her mother standing on opposite sides of a table, two parts of her world she never thought would meet. There were Polaroids of her old cakes. One labeled age 7, vanilla disaster. Another said 13, forgot candles, used matches. A photo of the birthday cupcake Eliot had brought with a note, "You are not forgotten." And, in the center of the wall, hung carefully with brass pins, was a copy of Linda's 6-page letter. Below it, Grace had added one sentence, printed in elegant script. She remembered in her own way. "And now, so do I." Linda stepped closer. Her hand rose instinctively, fingertips brushing the glass of her own handwriting. Her lips trembled. "You kept it?" Grace nodded. "I almost didn't read it," she said. "But I'm glad I did." Linda's voice caught in her throat. "I didn't know how else to reach you. Words, they've never been my strong suit." "You didn't have to say it perfectly," Grace replied. "You just had to say it." A pause. Then Linda asked, "Is it okay that I see all this? That you've kept these pieces?" Grace turned to her. "It's more than okay." She paused. "I used to collect them because no one else noticed. Now I keep them because I'm proud." They stood in front of the wall together for a long time. A daughter and a mother. Two timelines converging in one hallway. One shaped by silence. The other by a choice to speak. Later that evening, before Linda left, they sat on the balcony with soft music playing from Eliot's phone. The sky was turning gold, and birds flew lazy loops over the rooftops. Linda sipped tea slowly. Then, without looking up, she asked, "Do you still feel the need to collect things? Archive the pain?" Grace thought about it. "Not the pain," she said. "Just the proof. Proof that it happened. That I survived. That we're still here." Linda nodded. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she said quietly. Grace looked at her. "It's not something you deserve. It's something we build. One honest moment at a time." Her mother wiped at her cheek. "I want to keep building if you'll let me." Grace reached for her hand. "I already have." That night, when Grace placed a new note into the archive box, it wasn't from a cake or a photo or a birthday. It was a single sentence written in her mother's handwriting, torn from the bottom of the recipe binder. "This time I won't be late." And Grace believed her. Chapter 14. The birthday she didn't expect. Grace wasn't planning to celebrate her next birthday. Not because she was sad. Not because she forgot. But because, for the first time in her life, she didn't need to mark the day as survival. She had Eliot. She had her mother. She had peace. That, to her, was enough. So when July came again, she made no plans. No cake orders. No candles tucked in the drawer, just in case. She told Eliot she wanted to keep it quiet. Maybe take a walk by the lake. Maybe sketch. "I'm just happy," she said. Quietly. Eliot nodded. "Whatever you want." But of course, he had a different idea. The morning of her 20th birthday began simply. Sunlight through the curtains. Warm coffee. Eliot making her toast in the kitchen with too much butter, as always. A kiss on the cheek. A whispered, "Happy birthday, love." She smiled. Later, they took a long walk by Green Lake. Sat under the same tree they had once picnicked under when they were still just friends who might be more. Grace brought her sketchbook. Eliot brought a blanket. She drew people walking dogs. He dozed off in the sun. It was perfect. And when they got home, she was completely unprepared for what waited inside. The apartment lights were off when they stepped in. Then click. A string of fairy lights lit up the living room, revealing a cake. A real one. Frosted in pale yellow, set on the table with delicate pink candles. Scattered around it were small paper notes, folded into stars. And beside the cake stood Linda, smiling softly in a pale lavender dress. "Surprise," she said. Grace froze. "What is this?" Linda stepped forward, her voice calm but full. "It's your 25th birthday. And your first real party." Eliot squeezed her hand. "You said you didn't want to make a big deal. So we made a small one. But it's still a celebration." Grace looked around. On the walls were tiny prints of her old cake sketches, now framed in pastel borders. In the kitchen, a pot of lemon tea steamed gently. A card sat by the window, with a note from Eliot's sister. "To the bravest girl I've never met." And then Linda handed her a small gift box. Grace opened it slowly. Inside was a key. Confused, she looked up. Her mother smiled. "I rented us a space," she said. "A tiny place, just outside Portland. I've been taking more baking classes. I want to open a little shop, small cakes, simple ones, memory ones. And if you want to, I thought maybe it could be ours." Grace blinked. "You mean like a bakery?" Linda nodded. "A place for people who were forgotten, who want to remember. You could draw. I could bake." Grace stared at the key. All her life, she had held onto memories like artifacts, preserved them in boxes and journals, keeping her pain beautifully catalogued. And now, someone was handing her a future. She looked up at her mother, then at Eliot, then back at the cake. Finally, she laughed. A soft, genuine laugh. "Can I still blow out the candles?" "Only if you make a wish," Eliot said. Grace stepped forward, closed her eyes, and let the scent of sugar and lemon and possibility surround her. She didn't wish to be remembered. She didn't wish for things to be different. She wished to keep going. Exactly like this. Then she blew out the candles slowly, purposefully. When she opened her eyes, her mother was crying. Not because she was sad, but because they had finally arrived. Together. That night, after Linda left and Eliot was asleep, Grace sat alone at the table, the cake box open. A single star-shaped note in her hand. She read it once. Then again. It said, "You always deserve this." Grace added it to the archive box. And for the first time, she closed the lid without sadness. Because now, the story wasn't just about remembering what wasn't. It was about everything that finally became. Chapter 15. The softest ending. The space was small. Just a converted storefront with a creaky door and a cracked window that faced east, perfect for morning light. The sign above wasn't flashy. It was hand-painted in soft cursive by Grace herself. Second slice. Cakes and memories. Inside, the scent of lemon zest and vanilla welcomed anyone who walked through the door. There were only 5 tables. A worn bookshelf in the corner held journals where guests could write their stories. And on one wall hung a framed sketch, a little girl wearing a paper crown, holding a cake too big for her arms. Linda stood behind the counter every morning, apron tied, hands dusted with sugar. She didn't talk much, but her cakes spoke for her. Grace had insisted that each flavor be paired with a name: hope, apology, homecoming, wish. People asked what inspired the names. Grace always smiled and said, "My mom remembers every birthday." On the shop's soft opening day, they didn't expect a crowd. But by noon, the tables were full. A woman came in carrying a picture of her late husband. She ordered a cupcake called First Dance. A father brought his daughter, who had never celebrated a birthday before. She chose the one labeled Brave Year. A college student sat in the corner for 3 hours and finally wrote in the shop journal, "I never knew cake could taste like healing." Grace watched it all with quiet awe. She wasn't the girl planning her own party anymore. She was a woman creating a place for others to be seen. That evening, as the last customer left and the close sign swung gently in the window, Grace and Linda stood behind the counter, tired but glowing. They shared a slice of new beginning strawberry almond, their now traditional cake. Linda had added a touch of basil this time. Grace wasn't sure about it, but somehow it worked. "Do you ever think we'd get here?" Linda asked. Grace looked around the shop, the lights, the notes, the walls of framed letters and drawings, and said, "No. But I'm glad we did." Her mother's eyes glistened. "I still have a lot to learn." "We both do." Linda reached for her daughter's hand. "You taught me how to say I love you, Gracie. Even when I didn't use the words." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "And you taught me that even silence can mean something if we listen closely enough." That night, Grace sat in her apartment and opened the archive box for the last time. She didn't add anything to it. Instead, she emptied it. One by one, she laid each photo, letter, candle, and note across the floor. And as she touched them, she didn't feel hurt anymore. She felt gratitude. Not for the pain, but for what it led her to. For the people who stayed. For the cake she never stopped believing would come. She gathered the pieces and placed them all in a new box. Labeled not archive, but foundation. That was the year Grace no longer needed to remember what was missing. Because everything that mattered was finally here. A mother. A partner. A table set for more than one. And a cake. Soft. Imperfect and filled with love. Chapter 16. The girl who drew her way forward. Grace didn't plan to teach. But the idea came quietly one afternoon while she was sketching in the back of the shop. A girl, 10, maybe 11, sat at the farthest table with a slice of lemon cake and a glass of milk. Her name was Ava. She had come in 3 times that week, always with a small, worn-out notepad in her hands. She never said much, but Grace noticed how carefully she stared at everything: the shape of the chairs, the swirls in the frosting, the shadows on the floor. This time, Ava approached the counter and placed something on it. A folded drawing. Grace unfolded it slowly. It was a picture of the shop window, hand-drawn in pencil. The lettering on the sign slightly crooked but charmingly accurate. Second slice. Below it, Ava had drawn two women, one younger, one older, standing beside a three-tiered cake. Above them, in a shaky hand, it read, "I want to make places like this one day." Grace didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she asked gently, "Would you like to come by on Saturday morning? I can show you how to blend shadows better." Ava's eyes lit up like she'd just been handed a whole new world. That was how it began. Within a month, Saturday mornings became something sacred. Grace began calling them Sketch and Crumb. Kids from the neighborhood came in with crumpled notebooks and half-broken pencils. Linda baked mini muffins and let them sneak extra pieces when no one was watching. Eliot helped build a small bookshelf just for art supplies and storybooks. Grace didn't teach techniques so much as she taught attention. "Look first," she told them. "Let the world tell you where the line should go." They weren't just drawing cakes. They were drawing memories. One Saturday, a boy named Luca asked if she had always wanted to be an artist. Grace paused. "I think I always wanted to be seen," she answered. "And art was the only place where I felt like someone might look close enough." He nodded thoughtfully and returned to shading his cartoon dog. Grace smiled. These children weren't hers. But they were, in a quiet way, extensions of her healing. Each sketch they made was another reminder that the world could be kind if given the tools. Linda started leaving recipe cards for the kids, too. Some were blank, just titled, "Make Your Own Memory." Others had notes like, "For rainy days," or "Tastes better with laughter." Grace once asked her why she spent so much time making those. Linda simply said, "Because I missed too many moments when you were their age. I don't want to miss these." Grace reached across the counter and took her mother's flour-dusted hand. "You're not missing anything now." That evening, after the children had gone, Grace stood alone in the shop, looking at the wall of drawings they had begun to pin up beside the counter. Cakes, houses, dogs, suns, stars. But in nearly every drawing somewhere was the shop. Her shop. Their shop. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had become something more than she ever imagined. A soft corner of the world where forgotten birthdays and lonely girls became something else, part of a story that kept going. Grace took her own sketchbook and added one last picture that day. A small girl with a paper crown, standing in front of a cake, surrounded by children holding pencils and frosting-covered hands. She titled it, "Second Slice, Served with Love." And underneath it, she wrote, "I drew my way out. Then I opened the door for someone else." Chapter 17. The Recipe for Forgiveness. The small kitchen in the shop was warm from the oven's gentle heat, the air heavy with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. Linda stood by the counter, carefully folding batter into a mixing bowl, while Grace sat nearby, sketchbook open but forgotten. "I never thought forgiveness would taste like this," Linda said softly, dipping a spoon into the batter. Grace smiled. "It's sweeter than I imagined." Linda glanced up, a small laugh escaping her lips. "Funny how life works. I spent so many years thinking I had to earn your forgiveness. Like it was some prize I wasn't worthy of." Grace reached out, touching her mother's flour-dusted hand. "Maybe forgiveness isn't about earning. Maybe it's about choosing. Choosing to let go. Choosing to love despite the past." Linda nodded, eyes misting. "And baking these cakes, each one a promise I made, even if I broke it sometimes." They shared a quiet moment, the noise of the busy shop fading into the background. Then Grace said, "I've been thinking about something. About how we keep traditions alive. About how birthdays, cakes, memories, they're all recipes, right? Each ingredient matters." Linda smiled. "Exactly. And sometimes, the sweetest part isn't the sugar, but the care you put in." Grace stood and opened her sketchbook, revealing a new drawing, a recipe card, handwritten in flowing script, with flour smudges and little hearts decorating the margins. It read, "Recipe for Forgiveness. 1 cup of patience. 2 tablespoons of understanding. A pinch of humility. A generous helping of love." Linda leaned in, reading aloud. "That's beautiful." Grace closed the book gently. "It's not just a recipe. It's our story." Linda reached over and hugged her daughter tightly. "Thank you for letting me be part of it." Grace whispered, "Thank you for never giving up on us." That day, as the sun set behind the shop's faded sign, mother and daughter stood side by side, partners in baking, in healing, and in love. The recipe for their future was still being written. But one thing was certain. Every slice served from now on would carry a little more sweetness. Chapter 18. The First Cake Together. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Linda arrived at the shop. Hands tucked into the pockets of her worn jacket, cheeks flushed from the cold. Grace greeted her with a warm smile and a cup of steaming tea. "Ready to bake?" Grace asked. Linda nodded, her eyes bright. More than ever. The plan was simple but meaningful. Together, they would bake the first cake for the shop's official opening day, a lemon chiffon with raspberry glaze. A new recipe Linda had perfected after months of trial and error. The kitchen quickly filled with the sounds of clinking bowls, the soft hum of the mixer, and shared laughter. It was different from the early days of rushed dinners and missed birthdays. This time, there was space for mistakes, for questions, and for gentle guidance. Grace watched as her mother carefully folded the batter, steady hands steadying the process. "You're a natural," she said. Linda smiled. "You've taught me a lot. How to see beauty in the small things. How to be patient, not just with baking, but with people." They slid the cake into the oven and set a timer. While they waited, Grace pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw, a habit she never outgrew. Linda peered over. "What are you drawing?" "Us," Grace said softly. "Baking this cake together." Linda's eyes shimmered. "I hope one day we bake many more. And share them with the world." Grace nodded. "We will." The timer dinged, and together, they pulled the golden cake from the oven. As it cooled, they prepared the glaze, drizzling it over the cake in slow, deliberate strokes. Standing side by side, mother and daughter shared a moment of quiet accomplishment. It was more than just a cake. It was a symbol of how far they'd come. A tangible taste of healing. Chapter 19. The Invitation. The soft chime of the shop's bell announced a visitor. Grace looked up from the counter to see a woman standing hesitantly by the door, a familiar face she hadn't seen in years. It was Mallory, her college roommate, holding a bouquet of wildflowers and a bright smile. "Surprise," Mallory said, stepping inside. Grace's face lit up. "Mallory, what are you doing here?" "I'm in town for work," Mallory explained. "I heard about Second Slice from a friend, and I had to come see it for myself." Grace gestured toward the cozy interior. "Well, you're just in time for the afternoon tea." Mallory's eyes sparkled as she took in the walls covered with sketches and photos, the stacks of journals on the shelves. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "You've built something really special." Grace smiled shyly. "Thanks. It's been a journey." They settled at a small table, sharing slices of the Brave Year cake and catching up on life's twists and turns. Then Mallory pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted to give you this," she said. Grace opened it to find a photo from their college days, a candid shot of the two of them laughing over a messy birthday cake. "Remember this?" Mallory asked. "We made that cake after your birthday party didn't happen. You were so determined to celebrate." Grace chuckled. "I guess some things never change." Mallory reached across the table, squeezing Grace's hand. "You deserve all the celebrations in the world." Grace's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the warmth of being truly seen and loved. In that moment, surrounded by the sweetness of friendship and the glow of the shop's soft lights, Grace felt the last pieces of loneliness slip away. Her story was no longer one of forgotten birthdays. It was one of belonging. Chapter 20. The Gift of Presence. Grace stood by the window, watching the rain fall softly over the quiet street. Her hands rested on the small bundle cradled against her chest, a fragile new life that had already changed everything. Eliot stood beside her, his fingers gently brushing her hair back as they shared a quiet moment of awe and gratitude. The shop was closed for the day, but its warmth lived on in the stories and memories held within its walls. Grace thought back to the little girl who had once baked cakes alone in a lonely kitchen, who had sung birthday songs to herself with a crooked tiara on her head. That girl was still there, resilient, hopeful, and full of dreams. But now she was no longer alone. On the night of her baby's first birthday, Grace and Eliot gathered with Linda and close friends at the shop. The walls were decorated with soft fairy lights, and a simple cake sat on the table, made lovingly by Linda, with a tiny paper crown perched atop. As they sang Happy Birthday, Grace felt a fullness in her heart she had never known. Her mother's eyes shone with pride and love. Eliot smiled warmly, his hand steady in hers. And the little one, eyes wide and curious, reached out to touch the flickering candle. After the song, Linda pulled Grace aside. "I never thought I'd see this day," she whispered. "Not just your birthday, but this new beginning." Grace smiled through tears. "We're still writing our story," she said softly. Linda nodded. "And it's the most beautiful one yet." That night, as Grace tucked her child into bed, she placed a small, worn notebook beside the crib, the first in a new archive. Not of pain or absence, but of presence, of love, of the legacy they would build one birthday at a time.